Last week we covered how to worship the gods in a historical context. This week we're going to be putting that historical knowledge into practice with part 2 of our Worshipping the Gods mini-series. Part 1, Constructing an Altar. The first topic we'll start on today is how to construct an altar, because having a place to offer to the gods is extremely important. Building off of last week's video, we're going to cover the construction of an outdoor hörgr and an indoor shrine. For the outdoor hörgr, you're going to want to forage for some sizable stones. If you live in a city or just in a location without many stones lying around, it may be more efficient to go to a Home Depot, Lowe's, or another store that sells landscaping decor. Once you've gotten your materials, you should find a suitable ground on which to build your hörgr. The most ideal ground would be flat, away from other buildings, and somewhere where the hörgr is unlikely to be disturbed. Once you've found suitable ground, you should build the hörgr up like a pyramid, building a strong, solid foundation first, and slowly making it more narrow as you get to the top. Here's a photo of a stone hörgr or cairn for reference. You can make one that looks exactly like this one or something similar. There's no set build for a hörgr. This present configuration matches the description given in the Hyndluljóð stanza 10. For me a shrine of stones he made, and now to glass the rock has grown. Oft with the blood of beasts it was red, in the goddesses ever did Otar trust. This stanza also gives us great instruction as to how to use the hörgr. If you live in a city, or if blood sacrifice isn't economical or possible for you, you can substitute the blood sacrifice usually poured over the hörgr, as shown previously, with alcohol instead. We would personally recommend using distilled spirits rather than ale or mead as an offering if you're going to use alcohol as a substitute, because stale ale or wine over time does tend to smell rather unpleasant. If you're performing historical bloat with your hörgr, this is obviously not an issue. Just remember not to build that hörgr right next to another building or cooking area because the blood may attract animals and insects. If you're not hurting for cash, you can buy or even make a large god pole and smaller statues to go with it, rather than creating a stone hörgr and make an outdoor shrine like the one mentioned in Ibn Fadlan's Land of Darkness. As soon as their boats arrive at this port, each of them disembarks, taking with him bread, meat, onions, milk, and nabid, and he walks until he comes to a great wooden post stuck in the ground, with a face like that of a man, and around it are little figures. Then he leaves what he has with him in front of the wooden post. These can be a little hard to find, but they do make excellent outdoor shrines. Unlike the stone hörgr, the offerings given to these god poles are placed in front of the god poles in a Norse context, rather than directly poured over the poles themselves. It should be said that the blood or alcohol can also be sprinkled on the statues, but we'll cover that a little bit later in more detail. Offerings given to god poles can be anything from food items to votive offerings, as seen here. Then he takes a certain number of sheep or cows and slaughters them, distributing part of the meat as gifts and carrying off the rest to set before the great idol and the little figures that surround it. Then he hangs the heads of the sheep or cows on the wooden stakes which have been driven into the ground. Next up, the indoor altar. Indoor altars aren't as well attested to in the Norse sources, and so this section is mostly practice reconstructed with the information that the Lord does give us about sacred sites, objects, and temples, most of which we covered in last week's video in greater depth. We highly recommend watching it if you have not yet done so, because we went over the historical information of worship in great detail there. That being said, let's get into indoor altars. Indoor altars can be as complex or as simple as you'd like to make them. There is no set configuration for an indoor altar for personal use. That being said, there are some Heathen elements that you may wish to incorporate into your altar. The first Heathen element you might want on your altar is a god statue, like the ones mentioned above in the Land of Darkness or the one mentioned in Chapter 4 of the Arbygja saga, which we covered in last week's video. These statues can help you focus your prayers and focus your offerings on the gods in the way that the Heathens did. These statues need not be terribly complex, large, or expensive, but should be meaningful to you as a heathen. There are many shops on Etsy that offer great statues, and one of our favorite shops is Blegawood. We have many statues from them, and they're both affordable and high quality. We'll put a link in the description below for you guys to check it out. After the god statues, it's highly recommended to get a few candles for your altar, as fire was an integral part of heathen temples. We can see this in Kjalnesinga saga, chapter 2, in its reference to a sacred fire in a temple that never went out. On this there was to be a fire that would never go out. They called it sacred fire. While it's not necessarily a requirement to always have these candles going, and it's not recommended for safety purposes, it's a good idea to have them on your altar to incorporate the sacred fire that we see honored in Heathen practice. Fire was also used to sanctify places and objects, as we can see in the saga of Hakon the Good, Kjalnesinga saga, Arbygja saga, and in the Landnámabók itself. The next item we'd recommend to have on your altar is a drinking bowl or horn. As we covered in last week's video, alcohol is an extremely important part of Heathen ritual. This bowl or horn can be used to toast to the gods, a practice seen in the saga of Hakon the Good, to toast to the ancestors, mentioned in the same saga, or even to one's guardian spirits, as seen in Egil's saga. The drinking bowl or horn is an important object to have for ritual purposes. The last item we believe is essential on any Heathen altar is an offering plate or bowl. We can see in the Kjalnesinga saga, hörgr saga, and in the saga of Hakon the Good that a sacrificial bowl or hlaut bowl was very prominent on Heathen altars and in Heathen ritual, accompanied by a hlauttein or hlaut twig for sprinkling the contents of the bowl, and so both objects should have a place on any modern altar. This bowl can be filled with hlaut or sacrificial blood, or alcohol as a substitute for the same purpose of blessings and offerings. A sacrificial plate makes for a great space to place votive offerings or offerings of food, and as such one should have one around for that purpose. As far as obtaining a hlauttein or hlaut twig, a sprig of any evergreen will do the trick just fine. Part 2. Practicing at an altar. Now that we've covered how to make an indoor and an outdoor altar, let's move on to how to use them. First things first, we're going to cover how to consecrate our altars. We aren't given any specific instructions step by step on consecration and heathenry, but thankfully we can look to two places for a very likely answer, the Verlanda runestone and the Landnámabók. The Landnámabók tells us that Jorundur carried fire around where he would later build his temple. There he called it Svartingsstólum. He built a temple. That land, Jorundur carried fire around where he later laid his temple. We see this act repeated in hörgr saga by Thorolf. Thereafter Thorolf fared with fire through his land, out from Staff River in the west and east to that river which is now called Thor's River, and settled his shipmates there. We see this motif again in the Landnámabók with Helgi the Lean. Helgi kenned the whole district that summer, and settled all island firth between Siglunas and Roanes, and made a great fire at every river mouth, and thus hallowed to himself the whole district. Now that we've established one half of our consecration ritual, using fire, we should establish the second half, divine invocation. For this, we're going to need to take a look at the Verlanda runestone. The runestone's inscription is fascinating, asking the god Thor to hallow the runestone in the last portion, where it says Thoriki. This sets a precedent for calling upon Thor to hallow objects or spaces. If we take a look at the Thrimskvida, we can find Thor being called to hallow people, and in the context of the Thrimskvida, that was the bride. Then loud spake Thrym, the giant's leader, bring in the hammer to hallow the bride. On the maiden's knees let Mjolnir lie, that both us the band of Vor may bless. Using these two pieces together, the use of fire and divine invocation, we can reconstruct a solid consecration ritual for altars and spaces. Here's a simple consecration ritual. Feel free to use it as is or to edit it as you see fit. It should be said that giving an offering is a part of the provided ritual, and we explain just how to give offerings to the gods in the section directly after this section. What you'll need: a solid branch about a foot long if outside, or a bundle of herbs if inside. An established altar or hörgr. Step 1. Set your branch or bundle of herbs on fire. Note, please be aware of your surroundings. Fire is dangerous, sparks are dangerous, and it is important to take all necessary precautions to avoid any potential mishaps. Step 2. Take your burning branch or smoldering bundle of herbs and walk around your sacred space. Step 3. Invoke the god or goddess of your choice, Thor is the most historical, and ask them to consecrate the space. Step 4. Extinguish your flames and clean up the space as necessary. And Step 5. Give an offering at your altar or hörgr to the god or goddess you invoked. Now that we've covered how to consecrate an altar, we should move on to how to use it for worship, offerings, and prayer. Giving offerings at an altar will depend on what kind of altar you're using and what kind of offerings you're giving. Because of this, we'll break down this section into two parts, indoor altars and outdoor altars, with a discussion on the type of offerings that can be given for each altar. For an indoor altar, the easiest types of offerings to give are votive offerings and offerings of food and drink. Giving a votive offering is as simple as placing an object on the altar, dedicating it to the god or goddess in question, and then not using that object for yourself. Votive offerings are not retrieved from the altar and then used after by the giver of the offering. This is what makes the object an offering. Offering food and or drink is another simple offering that can be done at an indoor altar. Simply deposit the food onto the sacrificial plate or alcohol in a sacrificial bowl with the dedicatory prayer and allow it to sit at the altar for some time. It is recommended that if one is cooking food for a sacrifice, that one also toast the god being sacrificed to, as seen in Egil's saga and the saga of Hakon the Good. For disposing of the offering of food or drink after it has served its purpose, the offering can simply be taken outside and deposited somewhere in nature. This was not seen as disrespectful, as per Ibn Fadlan's Land of Darkness. For an outdoor altar, the best offering will be alcohol and or hlaut for a hörgr, and virtually anything can be given to a god pole. If you perform a historic bloat, offering the hlaut on a hörgr is as simple as covering the hörgr with the hlaut with a dedicatory prayer, as per the Hymn Oath. And to offer the hlaut to a god pole, simply sprinkle the hlaut onto the pole with a dedicatory prayer, as per the saga of Hakon the Good. If you're offering food, there really isn't a convenient way to do this with the hörgr. For that reason, it's recommended to stick to hlaut or alcohol for giving an offering over a hörgr, as the act is as simple as coating the stones with the liquid. Offering food or drink to a god pole is as simple as placing the food or drink in front of the god pole, saying a dedicatory prayer to the deity in question, and leaving the food and drink to be reclaimed by nature. As for votive offerings, the process is very much the same, simply leave the object at the pole and let it remain there. Part 3. Prayer and Offering. Now that we've covered how to create altars and how to use them, let's move on to one of the most important aspects of worship, prayer. Prayer is probably one of the least understood acts in heathenry, simply because of the amount of misinformation out there. Prayer is not always a complicated affair in heathenry, and there's no better example of simple prayer than in the Saga of the Volsungs. Within the opening pages of the Saga of the Volsungs, we see Hörgr and his wife pray to the gods for a child. Although they lived together with intimacy for a long time, they had neither heir nor child. That lack displeased them both, and they fervently implored the gods that they might have a child. It was said that Frigg heard their prayers and told Odin what they had asked. Here we can see that simply the act of praying was enough to gain the attention of the gods, rather than sacrifice or offering in certain instances. This should not be misconstrued as sacrifices and offerings not being important, but rather that they are simply not required in every context. A simple prayer will, sometimes, suffice. Praying to the gods doesn't have to be more complicated than simply taking a moment to connect with the gods and to offer a prayer for assistance. For greater endeavors, though, it is common to give an offering to the gods for success. We can see this in the example given in Ibn Fadlan's Land of Darkness, where the traders would give offerings in hopes of having a good trading season. Looking at an attempt to win the favor of the gods within the saga of Hakon the Good, we can see that a sacrifice was held and then the gods Odin, Freyr, Njord, and Bragi were toasted to, each for a specific reason. Odin for the victory and power of the king in the coming times, Njord and Freyr for good harvest and peace, and Bragi's bowl is thought to have been drank for oaths, as potentially confirmed in the Helge Kvide Horrorsonar. The last bowls would then be drank to the ancestors, as can be seen in the saga of Hakon the Good. This element of elaborate ritual appears to be reserved for greater necessity, rather than for regular worship. This should be expected, given stanza 146 of the Havamal. Better no prayer than too big an offering, by thy getting measure thy gift. Better is none than too big a sacrifice. So Thund of old wrote, ere man's race began, where he rose on high, when home he came. Here we see that Odin counsels us not to sacrifice too much, which lends itself to the idea that sacrifice should only be undertaken when it is necessary to do so, such as during holidays or before great endeavors. With that quote, we're going to wrap up this video and our mini-series on worshiping the gods. If you like this video, give it a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more practice-oriented content like this. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Gavin, and from our heathen household to yours, we're hoping you all have a fantastic day, and we'll see you in the next one.